Hello friends, in this video clip I'm going to talk briefly about producers. These organisms are autotrophs who produce their own sugars and organic materials, things like glucose. So we're going to talk about three major groups, the algae, the phytoplanktons, and we'll touch very briefly on plants. Producers are incredibly important in the ecosystem because they are the way that the food chain harnesses solar energy and turns it into sugars that can then move up the food chain. The first one we're going to talk about is actually a bacteria. Cyanobacteria are an ancient lineage of bacteria that photosynthesize. These little guys are named after their blue-green coloration. They are often colonial, but they are bacteria, so they are single-celled. This is the lineage that actually caused that initial oxygen revolution in the history of Earth, the one that killed off a lot of the anaerobic microbes and started the changes in the atmosphere that allowed for eukaryotes to evolve. These guys are hugely important in the ecosystem. They are eaten by a lot of different organisms. They can also cause problems. So sometimes we wind up with these cyanobacteria blooms, and these and other algae can actually cover the entire surface of the water, causing issues. We'll talk more about that process when we get to the ecology unit. The other algae we're going to discuss are all protists. These are eukaryotic organisms that are classified based on the primary pigments that they use. We will talk about a few different types of algae: red, golden, green, and brown. Golden algae is often unicellular and microscopic. There are some species, however, that are multicellular. These organisms have a large concentration of yellow and brown carotenoids, giving them their goldenish color. And again, these are all photosynthetic organisms. Some of them are mixotrophs, though, being able to also eat other organisms to get nutrients. Brown algae is one of the largest groups of algae, and it includes the largest algae species. Things like kelp are included in our brown algae. We also see other things like fucus, padina, and many others that we think of when we see the term seaweed. These guys are all multicellular, and most of them are marine, living out in the oceans. So again, these are a lot of things that we think of when you hear the word seaweed. And these organisms are kind of like the plants or trees of the oceans. Many of them produce habitats where other organisms can live. Many of the kelp forests are actually nurseries for deep sea organisms, sharks, fish, and other creatures that come into this safe zone. Red algae have a red pigment called phycoerythrin. This often masks the green chlorophyll in their cells and gives them their reddish tinge. These guys are able to grow at different depths than many of the other algae because of that red pigmentation. Usually these guys are multicellular and fairly large, and again, this is another group we often think of when we hear the term seaweed. These are very common in coastal waters and off the tropics, and some of them grow in deep sea areas. So if you guys like sushi, you may have actually eaten some red algae. Nori is a common species that is used for making sushi wraps. The last type of algae we'll talk about are the green algae. This is actually a paraphyletic grouping, meaning that it leaves out a branch. Green algae are named for their green chloroplasts. So these guys are very closely related to plants and have a lot in common with our land plants, which we'll talk more about later. There are two groups of green algae, the charophytes and the chlorophytes. Land plants are actually descended from charophytes. There are a huge number of different green algae. Many of them are microscopic, some of them colonial like Volvox that you see on your screen. Others are multicellular and look almost plant-like under the water. The next major grouping that we're going to talk about are the phytoplankton. These organisms are single-celled protists that are also hugely important as a food source in aquatic ecosystems. The first example I'm going to look at are the diatoms. These unicellular phytoplankton have a unique two-part shell that is made of a glass-like silicon dioxide. These guys are easily fossilized. That little glass-like shell builds up in the sediment and actually creates these. If you're a gardener, you may have also come across these. Diatomaceous earth is often used to help keep things like slugs and snails out of the garden. Dinoflagellates are another really cool example of phytoplankton. Dinoflagellates are known for having two flagella and have a reinforced cellulose-plated shell. These little guys are common all around the world. They are photoautotrophs, mixotrophs, and sometimes just heterotrophs. So there's two examples of dinoflagellates I want to mention. One is the organism that creates red tides. Red tide is produced whenever these dinoflagellates bloom and their populations spike dramatically. This particular species releases chemicals into the water, which creates a reddish coloration and actually kills off many other organisms, including fish. We've seen a major spike in red tides in the last few years because of warming oceans. The Gulf of Mexico on the Florida coast has actually been having some huge issues. The other dinoflagellate I want to look at is sea sparkle. These little dinoflagellates actually bioluminesce. So as the tides come in and the waves roll, these little guys get agitated and they start to bioluminesce, causing the waves to look like they are blue and sparkly. So apparently we have this species off the coast of North Carolina. I've not personally had an opportunity to go out and see them, but this is a really neat example of bioluminescence. Okay, our third major category are the land plants. So we're going to talk more about these guys later. I just want to point out that land plants often get all the credit for being the photosynthesizers, the primary food source, okay, and the ones that really create a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. However, algae and phytoplankton are larger in numbers and are far more important, especially in the marine ecosystems. So don't discount those autotrophs either. All right, that's it on our autotrophs. If you have any questions, just let me know.